Hey everybody, Brandon here. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be covering round number 3 of the Quebec Open under 2000 section in 2022. This was the 2022 Quebec Open. Alright, I am playing with the white pieces against Alessio, who I played before. I ended up winning against them earlier last time. I was playing with the black pieces in a Cambridge Springs. My opponent really didn't know the theory there, and I kind of locked out because of that. Now my opponent's playing as black in a position that I'm a little concerned to see. At least I used to be historically. Let's see what happens. E4, E6, D4, D5. So now I am in a French. Oh no. But I've done some work on the French between this time and the Canadian Open. Knight c3, allowing the winner. Bishop b4, e5, c5, a3, bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, knight e7, and queen g4. This is all very well known. No deviations or anything yet. Queen c7, and here I decide to make a change. Normally, people play queen takes g7. This is the most popular move by far. It has been played like 1,300 times, according to the live database. I played the second most common move, which people are a little bit less familiar with, at least French players, because this is not the only time I use this weapon. I end up using it a month or two later and surprising my opponent then as well. But alright, queen c7. I play bishop d3. This is the second most popular move. It's also played a few hundred times. But it is less expected, which is nice. So the way the game should go is c takes d4, knight e2, and they should probably take on c3. The line would go like this. Some sort of taking. And then bishop f4 or h4. Something like this is very likely, and it offers promising play. My opponent didn't know the theory and was a little surprised, and I was happy that this happened because I knew my opponent was good like they were very good at theoretical positions from my research. So I wanted to make sure that something like bishop d3 was playable, so it feels like I might have the more promising chance of getting an advantage here. So my opponent plays a knight b to c6, and I was happy to see this because this is not really a move. You kind of have to go into the line with taking on c3, queen takes g7, and all of that. And the argument before that I should mention is that the reason why you play bishop d3 here is instead if we go into this line, c takes d4, and you play a move like knight e2, which is a mainline move. The problem for us is that our bishop is on f1 and not on d3. Like, we're less developed. So bishop d3 is just trying to get more development, essentially. My opponent plays knight b6, and this is where, of course, I was totally out of book. It turns out the move is losing. But I had two ideas here. So I could take on g7 and enter complications, or I can just take back on d4. I opted for taking back on d4. I think this was the right call. And yeah, this actually is just straight up winning at this point. My opponent played bishop d7, intending to castle long and intending to still sacrifice the pawns on the king side if I wanted them. Doesn't make as much sense to go for them now. Also, queen takes g7 runs into rook g8, and then knight takes d4, which is something I wanted to avoid, because after knight takes d4, rut-row, let's say that. I could also take on h7, but still knight takes d4, which is actually a better line than what I mentioned. Queen h6, because at least we get a pawn here. But still, there's no reason to go for this. I end up actually castling, getting my king safe, and now there's potential of taking on g7 and h7. I don't necessarily want to because they're going to castle long and they'll have compensation for it. But they don't actually do that. I think castling long might be a more interesting chance. There's also an issue with taking and something like queen f6 or taking on f7. And maybe, yeah, we play like knight g3 or g3. We could probably take the pawns and survive. I don't know if I would have, but it is something to mention. All right, so g6 was played. And this is something I was happy to see. Generally, French players want to avoid playing a move like g6 because it weakens all of the dark squares. So my immediate instinct is to calculate a little bit. Can I do anything here promising? And I noticed a line where if we get our bishop to g5 and then f6, the rook has to move, and maybe we can actually take h7 and just go back and just argue we're up a clean pawn. And that's actually what I start to do. So bishop g5 to start. And I want to watch out for some like sort of h5s. But we don't really have to worry in these positions about h5. We can just play queen d8. And now it's annoying to castle long because we can take on e7. So they're not really in time to do so. Because queen h4 is something we want to play anyways. So they castle long. And again, I don't really want to play bishop f6 quite yet because maybe they play h5. So bishop f6, maybe they consider a move like h5. And then they move the rook. And all of a sudden h7 isn't really weak. So I play queen h4 first. And this attacks the knight. It asks, do you want to play knight f5 or not? I was happy to see knight f5. Because I can take it and then take on d8. So that's a problem. And if they don't do that, then they have to defend it. So they played rook d8 to get out of the pin, and now knight f5 could be a thing. I play bishop f6. Again, since I'm out of any tempo with h5, feels like I can probably pick up the pawn and just win it. Rook hg8 was played. I take on h7. I saw knight f5. In positions like this, well, not immediately. I think that I can probably just take on f7, but in the future, I did see some knight f5s. They played rook ef8 to defend f7. Now knight f5 feels like it could be a move, and I don't 100% want to take it because maybe they, well, of course, they will take with the g pawn, and the rook's on the open file. So there's two options here. I could retreat my queen immediately, or I could play what I played in the game. I ended up playing g4, and I'm pretty happy with the move. I think it's reasonable, because I wanted to just prevent knight f5. So I did take a long time here, just to make sure that I wasn't missing anything stupid. Of course, there's no rook h8, luckily, because the bishop's there, and the queen's there, covering that square. Now we see king b8. I play rook fb1, starting to go for the queen side, because now that I won my pawn, I'm happy. I'm better on the king side for sure. I can just start remaneuvering. Queen h3, maybe move my bishop or something to bring the queen over, or maybe I don't. Maybe I go like queen f1, e1. There's a lot of ways to all of a sudden bring my pieces to the queen side where I have an open file, and it feels like I'm better there too. I'm better in the center, king side, and queen side. This should be winning. My opponent played knight c8. Here I played queen h3, just to bring my queen back. Knight a5. And here I played rook b2. Other moves were like a4 or like rook b4, just to prevent knight c4. But I thought rook b2 was promising. And I was hoping for knight c4, followed by b takes c4. And it turns out that's actually what happened. Or, yeah, that ends up happening. So I take on c4, and then d takes c4. And I think there's a move here. Supposedly a lot of moves are still winning. I would argue the move that I played, maybe this is tooting my own horn, but I think the move that I played is probably best. And it relies on strategic and tactical factors. So what's the strategic idea? What is black's next move if they're able to play again? Black's next move is bishop c6, right? Because bishop c6, g4 can all of a sudden start being a problem. But I wasn't worried here, because I can close off the diagonal in an interesting way. I can play d5, a pure pawn sacrifice. Well, I won h7, so it's not as much of a worry. The bishop on f6 covers e5, so I don't have to worry about that pawn hanging either. E takes d5 was played. And now I have knight to d4. So after knight to d4, I can play c3 to keep the piece safe. I want to make sure that I blockade and don't allow d4 anyways. Like if I play c3 here, something that they should consider is some sort of like d4 anyways. Or at least they can potentially get the bishop open, even if it's just like a trade or something. C3 just doesn't really feel right, and we're not really scared of c3 from our opponents because rook b3 and the c3 pawn will fall. And again, these two rooks are doing absolutely nothing. There's no rook h8. The rooks can go to e8. This rook can go to e8, but what's it doing on e8? It's attacking a pawn that's perfectly defended. So knight d4. Now we see queen c5, and I play c3 just to cover everything. Knight b6. And I go a4, giving up the pawn. I didn't see anything wrong with it. So knight takes a4. The idea is, I was thinking of rook ba2, b5, and I was looking at rook takes a4, which is wrong. And I think I would have realized this when I was going to play the position, but I can just go like rook b1. The knight's really uncomfortable here. King a8. And then there's a really strong move here, which I don't want to say because it kind of spoils later in the game. But I have a strong move in this position, and when we see it, I'll mention it. Okay. So a4. My opponent didn't end up taking on a4. They went queen c8, trying to attack the g4 pawn, and I thought this was interesting because if I go f3. Then maybe now they take on a4. It felt wrong to play f3. Something felt off. This is winning, but I'm happy with the move I played. I played knight b5, and I think this is very tricky and maybe not immediately obvious. So the idea is if they take, this is a surprising exchange for us. But it's totally winning because now we're going to play a5 and then rook b1 and b7 is just going to fall. It's just going to fall. We don't have to worry about d4, like opening the long diagonal, because there's no light squared bishop anymore. So this would win. Straight up. Just completely winning. Instead, knight b5 sets a trap. And the trap is they can take on g4. But they can't. There's actually tactical reasons why it doesn't work. My opponent ends up taking, missing the idea, but queen g3 actually just straight up wins a piece. Like, this is unavoidable at this point. So if they play bishop e6, I play a5, kicking the knight. The knight moves back. And then knight d6, attacking the queen and attacking b7. This is over now. Like, the queen has to move to the 7th rank. Or they can, I guess they actually have queen c6. But after rook takes b7, we can immediately see that this is not going to end well. At the very least, yeah, like rook b1. There's also like queen e3 just transferring over as well, like queen c5, and rook b1 is still coming. So that's hopeless, and we can end the evaluation after knight d6. There's not really much more to calculate because they don't have a way to defend b7 and they can't play b6. So actually maybe we should show that a5 knight d6. They don't have time to play b6, which is important. Okay, so queen g3. And all of a sudden, there's not really a good way to defend their bishop. Like, if they want to defend against the potential mate here, or like just mass amounts of material being lost from knight d6, they're running into another move as well, which is e6 check and then queen takes g4. If they play king a8, then again, I actually have e6 here still. And there's also a5 as well, which looks pretty good. So there's just too many wins here. Queen e6 was played, but now a5 comes anyways. Knight a8, and I could look at something like knight d6, but it makes no sense at this point. There's a much more concrete way to win, which is knight d4. And knight d4 forces the queen back, and then e6 check will just pick up our bishop. And e6 was the move to mention before, where if we go into this position instead of rook takes a4, instead if we go rook b1, king a8, there's actually e6 here, which wins the game. And let's see how things go. So again, queen g3, queen e6, a5, knight a8, knight d4, queen c8, and now e6 check. We're picking up the bishop. At this point, the game's just over, but the game goes on for a little bit. Knight c7, queen takes g4, winning the piece. F takes e5, bishop e5 just to pin the knight. King a8, rook a b1. I'm just threatening to take on b6, or b7. My apologies. Knight a6, rook takes b7. I evaluated this as winning. Generally, you know, you don't want to exchange pieces when you're on the attack, but there's a very good reason here. Even though it's equal material that I'm trading here, the two rooks for the queen, the problem is the remaining material on the board for black just doesn't have a good chance of holding anything together. After takes, rook takes b7, takes, I can take on e6, and the king's just wide open. This is just dead lost at this point. So that would be good for us. And yeah, so rook takes b7. And then queen c5 was played. I took on e6. Rook to d8, and after my next move, my opponent resigned. There's several moves that win here. Queen takes a6 actually wins, I believe, the fastest. I ended up not playing that. I went for queen c6 because I thought this was faster. And this is still a really fast way to win. The only thing that like can be done here is, of course, you have to trade. Otherwise, there's like threats of rook b8 mate. But once you trade and knight takes c6, there's those problems with just taking on a7. So the reason why this isn't like the fastest win is because of rook d7 and then rook g7 and then knight c7. But that's pretty ridiculous at that point. Like, I think at that point it does not matter. So I was happy with queen c6. My opponent ends up resigning here because they can't do anything about rook b8 or again the mate on a7 or b8. So this was a good game I was pretty happy with, and I think highlighted that I was working a lot more on my calculation. I also spent a lot more time on this game, I think, in key moments, which was really important as well. So I felt like this was a pretty high form game, and it's one that I'm pretty proud of. Especially this move d5. I think the d5 is a really key concept that might be hard for some people to play. And I was really surprised at myself for, first off, thinking about the move in the game and playing it. I felt really, really content with my play, especially after d5. And I felt like I'm going to win this after d5. And it all goes back to working on my calculation and working on my time management, which I, for the most part, solved in this event. But there's some hiccups, as we'll see. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. Round number 3 of the Quebec Open, and I will see you all in round number 4. Have a good one. Bye-bye.